In the sterile, insulated world of a first-class cabin, a wealthy family of 3 believes their privilege grants them the right to choose their company, turning their backs on a man they deem beneath them. But their flawless journey takes a terrifying turn when a sudden medical emergency threatens the life of their young daughter. As their wealth and influence prove utterly useless, they are forced to confront a brutal truth. The only person who can save them is the very man they had so readily dismissed. If you liked the video and have subscribed to my channel, let's move on to our story. Enjoy watching. The polished marble floor of the exclusive lounge felt cold and unforgiving beneath the soles of Eleanor Sterling's Italian leather boots. She tugged at the hem of her cashmere shawl, a small gesture of discontent that was as much a habit as the permanent, subtle purse of her lips. At 42, Eleanor was a study in meticulously maintained perfection. A porcelain complexion untouched by the sun, hair the color of spun gold, and eyes a sharp, glacial blue that rarely thawed. She was a woman who believed in order and hierarchy, in the unshakable truth that some people were simply meant to be on top. Her world was a carefully curated collection of first-class experiences, private club memberships, and exclusive invitations. And at this moment the universe was failing to live up to her standards. Richard Sterling, Eleanor's husband, stood by a floor-to-ceiling window, a man carved from the same privileged quarry. His expensive suit was tailored to a flawless fit, his silver hair was impeccably groomed, and his jaw was set with the silent, formidable authority of a man who controlled boardrooms and markets with a single word. His impatience was a quiet hum, not an outburst. He checked his Patek Philippe watch for the 3rd time in as many minutes, his mind already 3 steps ahead, planning the meetings and deals that awaited him in Geneva. Their 7-year-old daughter Lily, a miniature replica of her mother with bright, curious eyes and a mop of sun-kissed curls, was oblivious to the tension, absorbed in a tablet game. She was the one part of their lives that didn't adhere to the rigid order of things, a vibrant splash of color in a world of muted grays and beiges. Their flight to Geneva was a long one, 12 hours that Richard intended to use for a few key conference calls and some undisturbed rest. They were booked in the first-class cabin, a sanctuary of peace and privacy where they could be insulated from the masses. Or so he thought. A new figure entered the lounge, a man with a quiet, confident stride that belied his unassuming attire. He was tall, with broad shoulders, and wore a simple, well-fitting polo shirt and khakis. His skin was the color of rich mahogany, and his movements were deliberate and calm. This was Dr. Eris Thorne. He was on his way to a medical conference, a last-minute decision to present some groundbreaking research he had conducted on cellular regeneration. Dr. Thorne was not a man of great wealth, but his mind was a treasure trove of knowledge and empathy. He had spent his career not in a sterile, private clinic but in a bustling urban hospital, where he had dedicated his life to healing people from all walks of life. His hands, though not gloved in fine leather, were strong and capable, having performed countless surgeries and saved countless lives. He carried a small messenger bag, a stark contrast to the Sterling family's expensive luggage, but it held the one thing that truly mattered to him: his research papers. As the boarding announcement for their flight, Swissair 327, echoed through the lounge, the Sterling family moved with the practiced efficiency of those who never had to rush. They were the first to board, their presence a silent proclamation of their status. Dr. Thorne followed shortly after, making his way to his assigned seat in the first-class cabin. The first-class cabin of the Airbus A380 was a picture of modern luxury. Each suite was a private cocoon, designed for maximum comfort and seclusion. The Sterling seats were in the center row, a block of 3 facing a single seat across the aisle. As they settled in, Richard took the window seat, Eleanor took the aisle, and Lily took the one in between them. It was a familiar arrangement, a buffer against the outside world. Then Dr. Thorne arrived. His boarding pass directed him to the seat directly across the aisle from Eleanor, in a 2-seat configuration. He offered a small, polite smile as he stowed his bag in the overhead compartment. Eleanor's gaze, however, was anything but polite. She watched his every move, a flicker of something she would never name, a mix of revulsion and indignation, crossing her face. The fact that this man was in her space, in her class of service, was an affront to her carefully constructed reality. "Richard," she said, her voice a low, dangerous whisper that only he could hear. "Look at this." Richard glanced up, following her icy stare. He saw the man, a doctor, calmly settling into his seat. He registered Eleanor's disapproval, a familiar signal of an impending scene. He sighed internally, his mind already calculating the quickest way to solve this. Eleanor was like a finely tuned instrument. If one note was off, the entire symphony was ruined. "Excuse me," Eleanor said, her voice now louder, dripping with a condescending sweetness that was far more cutting than outright anger. She leaned across the aisle and addressed a passing flight attendant, a young woman named Clara, who was already flustered by the pre-flight chaos. "I believe there has been a mistake. My husband, my daughter, and I were promised a quiet, private area. This arrangement is not what we expected." Clara, a veteran of these types of confrontations, maintained her composure. "Ma'am, all the seats are assigned. Your party has a row of 3 seats, and this gentleman is in his assigned seat across from you." Eleanor's lips thinned. "I understand how seating works. What I'm telling you is that it's not acceptable. We are a family and we require our privacy. We would like to be moved." Her eyes flickered towards Dr. Thorne, a clear, unspoken message of her disdain. Dr. Thorne, who had heard the entire exchange, simply closed his eyes, a silent expression of weary patience. He had encountered this kind of prejudice before. It was a tedious, exhausting dance he was forced to perform far too often. He knew better than to engage. There was no point in arguing with someone whose mind was already made up. He just wished people like Eleanor would realize that her perceived social superiority was an illusion, a paper-thin veneer that could be torn away in an instant. Richard, sensing that the flight was about to be delayed, stepped in. "Look," he said, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "Is there any way to accommodate us? We are longtime customers of this airline. A quiet family holiday." He made sure to emphasize the word family, as if it was a shield against any possible objection. Clara, knowing that the Sterlings were, in fact, incredibly important clients, looked at her seat map on her tablet. The first-class cabin was full. There were no other single seats, let alone a block of 3, available. "I'm sorry, sir, the cabin is fully booked. We can try to move you once we are in the air, but I cannot make any promises." Eleanor's face turned a shade of crimson. "This is ridiculous. I'm not sitting here for 12 hours with him directly across from me. Find a solution." The commotion had started to attract the attention of other passengers, a few of them peeking out of their private suites. Dr. Thorne simply opened his book, a medical journal, and began to read, a quiet protest against the spectacle. Clara, desperate to de-escalate the situation, made a last-ditch effort. "Ma'am, I can ask this gentleman if he would be willing to move to a crew seat for takeoff, and then perhaps we can find an arrangement after we are airborne?" she offered, though she knew it was a long shot. "No, that's not necessary," Dr. Thorne said quietly, his voice calm and even. He looked at Eleanor, his gaze steady and unwavering. "I will not be a source of discomfort for you. I will find a different seat. Enjoy your flight." He gathered his belongings, a small act of grace that seemed to infuriate Eleanor even more. He walked to the back of the cabin, a quiet, dignified retreat. Clara, relieved, hurried to find him a new seat. The Sterlings finally settled into their seats, the family sense of order and peace restored. The plane's engines began to hum, a deep, powerful thrum that vibrated through the fuselage. Lily, oblivious to the entire confrontation, had fallen asleep, her head resting on Eleanor's shoulder. The cabin lights dimmed, and the plane began its long rolling journey down the runway, gathering speed. Richard closed his eyes, already thinking about his impending meetings, and Eleanor pulled her cashmere shawl tighter around herself, a silent victory in her mind. They were finally at peace, insulated in their bubble of privilege, ready for the 12-hour journey ahead. The world outside and the people in it had been put in their proper place. But the bubble was about to burst. And the man they had cast out was the only one who could save them. The hum of the aircraft's engines settled into a soothing drone, a lullaby that carried the Sterling family high above the earth. Below, the city lights twinkled like scattered jewels, growing smaller and more insignificant with every passing moment. Inside the quiet luxury of the first-class cabin, the atmosphere was one of serene contentment. The minor annoyance of the seating arrangement had been resolved, and Eleanor now felt a profound sense of relief. She had asserted her will, and the world, as it always did, had bent to her command. She adjusted the blanket over Lily, who was still sound asleep, and leaned her head back against the plush headrest, a quiet smile playing on her lips. Richard, meanwhile, had opened his laptop, the soft glow of the screen illuminating his face as he reviewed complex financial models. Their bubble of privilege was, for the moment, inviolate. In the back of the cabin, in a repurposed crew seat, Dr. Eris Thorne had settled in with an air of stoic acceptance. The seat was cramped, the armrest digging uncomfortably into his side, but he had long ago learned to find peace in less than ideal circumstances. He hadn't felt a flicker of anger or bitterness toward the Sterlings. He had simply felt a familiar weariness. It was an energy he could no longer afford to waste on people who refused to see beyond their own preconceived notions. He had briefly considered making his way back to his assigned seat after takeoff, but decided against it. There was no point. The damage was done, the message received. Instead, he pulled out his tablet and began to review his presentation. The complex diagrams of cellular structures, a welcome distraction from the petty dramas of the world below. The flight had been underway for just over an hour when the first sign of trouble appeared. Eleanor, her contentment still holding firm, noticed a slight, almost imperceptible twitch in Lily's fingers. She dismissed it as a dream, a natural part of a child's sleep. But then Lily's breathing changed, becoming shallow and slightly ragged, punctuated by a soft, wheezing sound. Eleanor leaned in closer, a faint thread of unease beginning to unravel her tranquility. "Lily, sweetie, are you okay?" she whispered, gently shaking her daughter's shoulder. There was no response. Eleanor's heart rate quickened. She placed a hand on Lily's forehead, expecting the clammy coldness of a fever, but what she felt was a sudden, alarming heat. She glanced at Richard, who was still absorbed in his spreadsheets. "Richard, something's not right," she said, her voice laced with a growing panic. Richard's gaze remained fixed on his screen. "She's just sleeping, Eleanor. Don't worry so much." But Eleanor's intuition was screaming. Lily's breathing was now labored, a rattling, choking sound that cut through the quiet hum of the cabin. Her small body began to shudder, not in a gentle dreamlike way, but in a series of violent, convulsive spasms. Her face was flushed crimson, and her lips were a startling shade of blue. A single gut-wrenching realization slammed into Eleanor. Her daughter was in distress and she was completely, utterly helpless. "Richard, help me!" she shrieked, her carefully composed facade dissolving into sheer terror. Richard finally looked up, his brow furrowed in annoyance that quickly morphed into stark horror as he saw his daughter. The laptop clattered to the floor as he scrambled to unbuckle his seatbelt, his brain struggling to process the sight of his child fighting for air. Eleanor, her hands shaking uncontrollably, fumbled for the call button. A flight attendant, Clara, appeared moments later, her face concerned. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" "No. My daughter. She can't breathe," Eleanor wailed, her hands trembling as she tried to comfort Lily, who was now limp, her body still convulsing. Clara took one look at the girl's dusky complexion and the panicked faces of her parents and immediately understood the gravity of the situation. Her years of training kicked in. She knelt, checking for a pulse, but all she found was a weak, thready beat. She immediately grabbed the cabin phone. "Captain, we have a medical emergency in first class. A child is in anaphylactic shock. We need to find a doctor on board immediately." Her voice, usually calm and professional, was sharp with urgency. An announcement, clear and commanding, echoed through the plane speakers. "This is your captain speaking. We have a medical emergency on board. We are looking for any medical professional, a doctor, a nurse, or a paramedic. Please report to the first-class cabin immediately. I repeat, we need a medical professional to report to the front of the aircraft." The sound of the captain's voice was the sound of hope, but to Eleanor and Richard, it was also a crushing reminder of their own failure. Their wealth and influence, the very things they had built their lives around, were completely meaningless in the face of this crisis. They could not buy a solution to this. They could not command the air to enter their daughter's lungs. All they could do was watch, their faces a mirror of each other's terror. Dr. Eris Thorne heard the announcement. He was still in his cramped seat at the back of the first-class cabin. His first instinct was to rise, but then he hesitated. A moment of bitter irony washed over him. The very people who had just publicly humiliated him were now calling for help, for the one thing he could provide that no amount of money could ever purchase. The thought was fleeting, however, because it was immediately followed by a wave of something far more powerful. His professional oath. His life's work was dedicated to saving lives. The face of the family who had wronged him was irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the child. Without another thought, he rose from his seat, his broad shoulders filling the aisle. He moved with purpose, a calm force of nature against the rising tide of chaos. Passengers in other suites looked out, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. When he arrived at the front of the cabin, Clara's eyes widened in relief. "Dr. Thorne," she breathed, "thank God." Eleanor's head snapped up. She saw the man she had so readily dismissed, the man she had looked down upon with such open contempt. His presence now was an unassailable rebuke, a silent, powerful monument to her own staggering arrogance. She could not meet his gaze. Richard, however, looked up, his face a mask of desperate hope and shame. He recognized the man from the lounge, the same man he had helped humiliate. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth. Dr. Thorne didn't acknowledge their past interaction. His focus was entirely on the small, fragile life before him. He knelt by Lily's side, his movements swift and professional. "What's the history?" he asked, his voice calm and authoritative. "Any known allergies?" "No, none. We don't know what happened." Eleanor stammered, her voice a cracked whisper. Dr. Thorne nodded, his fingers on Lily's wrist, feeling for a pulse. "It's anaphylaxis," he said, his diagnosis immediate and certain. He looked at Clara. "Is there an emergency medical kit on board?" Clara returned with the kit, a bright orange box. Dr. Thorne opened it, his eyes scanning the contents with a practiced speed. He found the epinephrine pen. "Give me a second," he said, his voice clipped and precise. He expertly administered the shot into Lily's thigh, the needle a flash of silver against the folds of her dress. They watched, a silent tableau of fear and hope, as the medicine worked its magic. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the blue began to recede from Lily's lips. Her breathing, though still ragged, became less strained. The convulsions subsided. A weak, tired sigh escaped her lips as her eyes fluttered open, confused and dazed. The Sterlings sagged back in their seats, a collective gasp of relief escaping them. Richard buried his face in his hands, his body trembling with the aftershocks of a terror so profound it had shaken him to his core. Eleanor, for the first time in her life, found herself speechless. Her eyes, filled with tears, looked at Dr. Thorne, the man who had just saved her daughter. The man she had treated with such contempt. The man who had a moment ago been a symbol of her contempt was now a savior, a quiet, dignified figure who had just brought her child back from the brink. He stood up, his work done. "She's stable for now," he said, his voice calm and professional. "But we need to monitor her closely for the next few hours. If there's an available seat near them, I'll need to stay close." Clara, her eyes filled with gratitude, looked at him. "Dr. Thorne, of course. Please come with me. We have a seat open in the jump seat area, and you can stay close by." He nodded, a silent acknowledgement of her gratitude, and turned to look at the Sterlings one last time. He saw their faces, marked by a humility and vulnerability he had not thought them capable of. He gave them a small, professional nod, a gesture of reassurance, and then followed Clara, leaving them alone in their private cabin with their daughter, and with the heavy, unshakable burden of their new reality. The world was no longer bending to their will. It had just shown them how fragile their perceived power truly was. The hushed stillness that followed the crisis was heavier and more profound than the quiet that had preceded it. In the center of the first-class cabin, Lily lay draped in a blanket, her breathing now even and deep. Her small face, no longer mottled with the dusky flush of panic, was soft and serene in sleep. To Richard and Eleanor, she looked more beautiful than she ever had, each gentle rise and fall of her chest a sacred, life-affirming rhythm. The terror that had gripped them just minutes ago was a raw, trembling memory, a cold hand on their hearts. They were alone in their private suite, but the feeling of insulation was gone. The polished walls and plush upholstery felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage, a place where they had almost watched their daughter die, believing their comfort and their privilege were all that mattered. Eleanor sat beside Lily, her hand lightly resting on the child's forehead. The heat was gone, replaced by a normal, healthy warmth. She could feel the lingering tremor in her own hands and the sting of tears in her eyes. The tears were not just from fear, but from a crushing, unbearable shame. She looked at her husband, who was slumped in his seat, his head in his hands. The man who had been so effortlessly in control, so confident in his ability to command the world, was now just a father who had been brought to his knees by the fragility of life. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. Their entire worldview, a meticulously built edifice of their own making, had crumbled in the span of a few panicked minutes. The silence was a powerful accuser. Every thought that had filled Eleanor's mind just a short while ago, her disdain, her sense of entitlement, her cold dismissal of the man who now held her daughter's life in his hands, came back to haunt her. The irony was a bitter poison. The very man she had publicly humiliated, the man she had so casually cast out of their orbit, was the one person who had been able to save them. Finally, Richard lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed and held a naked vulnerability Eleanor had never seen. "We have to go and thank him," he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "We have to." Eleanor nodded, unable to form words. She carefully laid Lily's head on a pillow and rose, her movements stiff and uncertain. Together they walked through the hushed cabin, a silent pilgrimage of atonement. They found Dr. Thorne in a small, cramped crew seat near the galley, a medical journal open on his lap, his expression calm and focused. He looked up as they approached, his gaze professional and steady, devoid of judgment. "Dr. Thorne," Richard began, his voice thick with emotion. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his business card, the elegant font and silver engraving a stark contrast to the gravity of the moment. "My name is Richard Sterling. That's my wife Eleanor and our daughter Lily. Oh, there's no way we can ever thank you enough. Anything you need, anything at all, just call. I want to compensate you for your time, for your expertise." He was falling back on what he knew, on the language of business and debt. Dr. Thorne took the card and glanced at it before placing it in the pocket of his khakis. "Mr. Sterling," he said gently, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who had seen it all. "There's no need for that. I'm a doctor. It's what I do. I'm just glad she's going to be okay." He offered a small, reassuring smile. "No compensation is necessary." Eleanor stepped forward, her throat tightening with emotion. She had to do this. She had to say the words. "Dr. Thorne," she said, her voice trembling. I was incredibly rude to you. Incredibly. My behavior was unforgivable. I'm so deeply, deeply sorry. For all of it." Her voice broke on the last word and a tear slid down her cheek. Dr. Thorne's gaze softened. He looked at her, truly saw her, not as the woman who had treated him with contempt, but as a terrified mother who had just had the most important lesson of her life. He simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of her apology. "I understand," he said, his voice kind. "Fear can make us say and do things we don't mean. What matters is that your daughter is safe." The weight of his words, his grace, his complete lack of resentment, was more powerful than any retribution could have been. He had not only saved their daughter's life but had also, without a single harsh word, exposed the hollow nature of their prejudice. He was a man of substance, a healer, and they were, in that moment, merely two people humbled by their own folly. After a few more minutes of quiet, grateful conversation, they returned to their suite. They sat in silence, holding hands, no longer focused on spreadsheets or social standing. The hum of the plane's engines was no longer a symbol of their comfortable isolation, but a reminder of the fragile, interconnected nature of the world. They had looked down on a man who was their superior in every way that truly mattered, and they would never be the same again. The rest of the 12-hour flight stretched out, no longer a serene journey but a long, quiet vigil. The air in the first-class cabin, once a symbol of comfortable isolation, now felt heavy with unspoken truths. Eleanor and Richard sat side by side, their hands clasped over Lily's blanketed form. Every shallow breath, every minor twitch from their sleeping daughter, was a source of relief and a painful reminder of how close they had come to losing her. They were no longer a family wrapped in a bubble of privilege. They were simply two parents, humbled and terrified, brought to a common ground of vulnerability. Eleanor stared at the empty seat across from her, the very spot where Dr. Thorne had sat just hours earlier. The shame was a physical ache in her chest. She thought about his quiet dignity, his lack of bitterness, and his immediate, selfless action. Her world had always been so black and white, defined by rules of class and social standing. Now she was learning that the most profound and important truths were found in the shades of gray, in the small human gestures that mattered more than any financial statement. After a couple of hours, as Lily continued to sleep soundly, a new need arose, stronger than their shame. They needed to talk to him again, not to apologize for that had been done, but to truly understand the man they had so grievously misjudged. It was a need for connection, for closure, and perhaps for a measure of redemption. They found him still in the cramped crew seat, his tablet now put away. He was watching a documentary on a small screen, but he was completely still, lost in his own thoughts. As they approached, he glanced up, his expression professional and composed. We just wanted to check on you, Dr. Thorne," Richard said, his voice softer than Eleanor had ever heard it. "And to ask you about yourself. We didn't get the chance earlier." Dr. Thorne gestured to the two empty jump seats. "Please sit." They settled in, the three of them forming a small, quiet circle in the back of the cabin. It was an awkward moment, but a necessary one. "You said you were going to a conference," Eleanor began, her voice still a little shaky. "Are you a cardiologist?" Dr. Thorne smiled slightly. "I'm a pediatric cardiologist. I specialize in congenital heart defects in children. The conference is in Geneva, and I'm presenting some research on cellular regeneration to help repair infant hearts." Eleanor felt a fresh wave of shame wash over her. The man she had dismissed as inconsequential dedicated his life to healing children's hearts. "My goodness," she breathed. "You're doing incredible work." Richard, usually the master of conversation, struggled to find the words. "And your practice? Where do you work?" "I work at a public hospital in Baltimore," Dr. Thorne replied. "We serve a diverse community, and we see everything from the rarest conditions to the most common ones. It's challenging, but it's rewarding." They talked for a long time, the rigid boundaries between them dissolving with each passing minute. They learned about his long hours, his passion for his work, and the countless families he had helped. He, in turn, listened to them talk about Lily, about the love they had for their daughter, a love that now felt so much more precious and fragile. He saw their transformation not as a sudden switch but as a slow, painful awakening. When the pilot announced their descent, a sense of quiet closure settled over their group. The conversation ended, but the connection remained. As they stood to return to their seats, Richard extended his hand. "Dr. Thorne, thank you for everything. I hope we see you again, in a different context." Eleanor, her eyes brimming with a new kind of respect, stepped forward. "Dr. Thorne," she said, her voice filled with a sincere warmth she hadn't known she possessed. "I am so sorry for my earlier behavior. You are truly an amazing person. Thank you." She then did something that surprised even herself. She reached out and hugged him, a small, genuine gesture of gratitude. It wasn't the kind of perfunctory hug one gives at a cocktail party. It was an embrace of genuine, heartfelt appreciation. He was momentarily surprised, but he returned the hug, a reassuring pat on her back. "Just take good care of your daughter, Eleanor. That's all that matters." As the plane touched down in Geneva, the Sterling family was no longer a unit of insular wealth. They were a family irrevocably changed, forever bound to a man who had not only saved their daughter's life but had also, without a single harsh word, taught them what truly mattered. They had embarked on this journey with an expectation of comfort and control, but they were landing with a lesson in humility and a profound sense of gratitude. Their old world was gone, replaced by a new, more complicated and more human reality. The world outside the private car that drove them from the Geneva airport was a blur of polished steel and modern architecture. The city, with its immaculate streets and shimmering lake, was a testament to order and wealth, a city built for people like the Sterlings. Yet, as Eleanor and Richard watched the cityscape pass by, they felt a profound disconnect. The luxurious hotel suite they had reserved months ago now felt less like a sanctuary and more like a stage where they were meant to play a part they no longer recognized. The silence in the car was not the comfortable quiet of a family in their own world, but the heavy, pregnant quiet of two people who had just stared into the abyss and come back changed. Lily, still tired from the ordeal, was nestled between them, her small hand clutched tightly in her mother's. Her presence was everything, a constant, gentle reminder of the fragile nature of life and the immense gratitude that now filled their hearts. Richard had made a flurry of calls from the plane, canceling his more tedious meetings and reorganizing his schedule. Business, which had once been his entire universe, had receded into a manageable background task. The meetings with venture capitalists and global executives could wait. Their time in Geneva was no longer about profit margins and market dominance. It was about family, and it was about a debt of a different kind. Once they arrived at the hotel, the usual routine felt strange and hollow. Eleanor bypassed the detailed check-in and the prearranged spa appointments. She went directly to their suite, not to unpack or call room service, but to sit with Lily. She watched her daughter sleep, her small chest rising and falling rhythmically, a simple miracle that she had taken for granted for 7 years. Later that afternoon, as Lily played quietly with her dolls, Richard came to sit beside Eleanor on a plush sofa, the city spread out below them. He held the small business card he had offered to Dr. Thorne, a piece of paper that now felt like a relic from another life. "I have to call him," Richard said, his voice decisive. "I can't just let it be. We need to do more than just apologize." Eleanor nodded, her eyes fixed on his. "I agree. We have to show him that we meant it. That we're not just paying a debt. That we are genuinely grateful. He gave us a second chance." Richard pulled out his phone, his finger hovering over the number. He was used to making calls that commanded attention and respect, calls that initiated multi-million-dollar deals. This call was different. It was an act of humility, a reach for connection that had nothing to do with money or power. He dialed the number, his hand feeling oddly clumsy. Dr. Thorne answered on the third ring, his voice warm and clear. "Hello, this is Eris." "Dr. Thorne, this is Richard Sterling." "From the flight," Richard began, the words feeling utterly inadequate. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. We just landed and we were wondering if you had any time this evening. We'd like to take you out to dinner. As a small token of our gratitude." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Richard held his breath, fearing a rejection, a quiet rebuke for their earlier behavior. "That's very kind of you, Richard," Dr. Thorne replied, his voice thoughtful. "I appreciate the offer. I'm just settling into my hotel, but I would be happy to join you. Where are you staying?" They agreed to meet at a modest but highly regarded local restaurant that evening, a far cry from the Michelin star establishments the Sterlings frequented. The choice of venue was deliberate, a silent acknowledgement that this was not about luxury, but about a genuine connection. That evening, as they walked to the restaurant, Eleanor and Richard felt a nervous anticipation they hadn't experienced since their first date. This was more than a dinner, it was a test of their sincerity, a bridge they were trying to build across a chasm of their own making. When they saw Dr. Thorne waiting for them, standing tall and at ease in a simple jacket and slacks, they felt a wave of relief. He greeted them with a genuine smile and a firm handshake. The dinner began with a quiet grace, free of the pretenses that usually surrounded the Sterling's social engagements. The small, intimate restaurant was filled with the low hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the gentle aroma of traditional Swiss cuisine. There was no discussion of business, no mention of stock prices or market trends. Instead, they talked about life. They spoke about Lily, her favorite cartoons, her love for drawing. Dr. Thorne, in turn, spoke about his work, about the challenges of providing healthcare in an underfunded system, and about the small victories that made it all worthwhile. They learned that he was a man driven by a profound sense of purpose, a man who found his joy in healing and his wealth in the well-being of others. He wasn't on a mission to prove anything to anyone. He was simply living his life with integrity. As the night went on, the rigid walls of class and status, so carefully constructed by the Sterlings, crumbled entirely. They were no longer the privileged elite and the man they had spurned. They were just people, sharing a meal and a story, bound together by a single life-altering moment of consequence. The conversation flowed effortlessly, a testament to the profound shift that had occurred. They had found in Dr. Thorne a friend, a mentor, and a powerful symbol of a different way of living. And as the evening drew to a close, a new thought began to form in Richard's mind. A thought about how he could use his own vast resources not for his own gain, but for something that truly mattered. The Geneva morning light, crisp and clean, streamed through the windows of the Sterling's hotel suite, illuminating a scene of quiet contemplation. The usual morning rush, the urgent phone calls, the meticulous review of schedules, was absent. Richard sat by the window, a mug of coffee growing cold in his hand, not looking at his phone but at the city below, seeing it not as a backdrop for a lucrative deal, but as a vibrant, breathing place filled with people and their own complex stories. Eleanor, her face bare of makeup, was sitting on the floor with Lily, building a castle out of blocks. The ease and intimacy between them was a new and profound gift, one they had almost lost. The feeling of the previous night's dinner lingered, a warm afterglow that had eclipsed the shadows of the flight. For the first time, their conversations weren't about what they possessed, but about what they could give. Richard turned to Eleanor, a determined glint in his eye. "I want to do it," he said, his voice firm. Eleanor knew exactly what he meant. She had seen the flicker of purpose in his eyes last night, a fire that had been absent from their lives for too long. "How?" she asked, a small smile playing on her lips. "How do we even begin to help someone like him?" "Our foundation," Richard replied. He was referring to the Sterling Foundation, an entity he had created years ago primarily for tax benefits and public relations. It funded scholarships to Ivy League schools and supported exclusive art galleries, projects that bolstered their social standing but did little to ignite their spirits. "We'll shift the focus. A major portion of our capital. I'll make a personal donation. We'll set up a fund specifically for his hospital, for his research, for anything he needs." Eleanor nodded, the idea taking root in her mind. "It can't just be a check, Richard. It has to be more than that. It has to be a partnership." She saw it clearly now. It was not about simply writing a check to assuage their guilt. It was about using their resources, their connections, their immense capacity to organize and execute, for a purpose that truly mattered. "We'll learn about his work. We'll meet his team. We'll invest our time, not just our money." Later that morning, with a new sense of purpose and a fresh sense of determination, Richard made the call. He found Dr. Thorne at the conference, the sounds of a busy lecture hall humming in the background. "Dr. Thorne, it's Richard Sterling again. I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all, Richard. Just between sessions. I'm calling because Eleanor and I have been talking. After last night, we realized something. We have a family foundation and frankly, it hasn't been used for anything that truly matters. I want to change that. I want to use it to fund your work. Your research, your hospital. Whatever you need to keep saving lives. A significant contribution, Dr. Thorne. One that would allow you to expand your team, upgrade your equipment, and continue your groundbreaking research without the constant worry of funding." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Dr. Thorne was for once speechless. He had dealt with wealthy donors before, but their philanthropy was often conditional, tied to their own agendas or a desire for recognition. This offer was different. It was an offer to truly partner, to give without strings. He could hear the sincerity in Richard's voice, a tone he hadn't heard on the flight. "Richard," Dr. Thorne said finally, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say. The needs are immense. We are constantly fundraising just to keep our doors open. This kind of help, it would be a game changer. For the hospital. For all the children we treat. Then we want to be a part of it," Richard said, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "We want to help. We're in Geneva for the rest of the week, but all of our other appointments have been cancelled. We would like to come to your conference. If you would have us. We want to see your presentation. We want to learn more about your work. We don't want to be spectators. We want to be partners." Dr. Thorne was deeply moved. He had seen the transformation in them at dinner, but this offer was a true test of their change of heart. "Of course. We'd be honored to have you." That afternoon, Richard and Eleanor, dressed in casual, understated clothing, made their way to the medical conference. The environment was a world away from the lavish boardrooms and exclusive clubs they were accustomed to. Here, the air buzzed with intellect, purpose, and a shared passion for healing. The people were not dressed in power suits, but in scrubs and sensible shoes. They were not talking about profit and loss, but about patient outcomes and new scientific breakthroughs. As they entered the lecture hall, Dr. Thorne was on stage, presenting his research on cellular regeneration. He spoke with a quiet confidence and a profound passion that transcended the technical jargon. Eleanor and Richard sat in the back, listening intently as he described the intricate process of repairing a damaged heart cell, a process that could potentially save thousands of children's lives. They were not just seeing a scientist, they were seeing the man who had knelt beside their daughter, his hands a source of calm and healing. After the presentation, Dr. Thorne introduced them to his colleagues, a diverse group of doctors and researchers from all over the world. They were all united by the same mission, to heal, to discover, to make the world a better place. As they spoke to these people, the Sterlings began to understand the true meaning of wealth. It wasn't about the money they possessed but about the impact they could have. They had found a new currency, one not measured in dollars and cents, but in lives saved and futures secured. When they left the conference, a new sense of hope and purpose had settled over them. They had come to Geneva seeking to expand their wealth, but they were leaving with something far more valuable. They were leaving with a mission. Their life, which had once felt so full, now felt truly complete for the first time. The journey was not just from one city to another, but from a life of hollow luxury to one of genuine consequence. The man they had once looked down on had not just saved their daughter, he had saved them as well. Returning to their sprawling, sun-drenched estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, felt like stepping onto a meticulously designed film set. The sprawling green lawns, the imposing stone facade of their mansion, the silent, attentive staff, it was all there, just as they had left it. But the Sterlings were no longer the same people who had departed. The marble floors, once a symbol of their unassailable status, now felt cold and impersonal. The fine art on the walls, once a point of pride, seemed hollow. The very air, which had always felt thick with comfort and insulation, now felt thin and unsettling. They were home, but their lives had shifted in a way that made their home feel foreign. The days that followed were consumed not by market reports or social calendars, but by a new, more urgent mission. Richard had his team of lawyers and financial advisors working around the clock to restructure the Sterling Foundation. The fund, which had been a quiet, almost forgotten appendage of their financial empire, was about to become its beating heart. He made the calls with a newfound sense of purpose, his voice resonating with an authority born not of arrogance but of conviction. He spoke of new partnerships and a new focus on urban healthcare, a term that had never once been uttered in his boardrooms. His advisors were surprised, but the seriousness in his voice was undeniable. Eleanor, too, was a different woman. Her mornings were no longer spent with personal trainers and stylists, but with her daughter Lily, who was now a constant, cherished presence. She also spent hours on video calls with Dr. Thorne and his colleagues, listening intently as they explained the hospital's needs. A new cardiac unit for pediatric patients, outdated imaging equipment, and a lack of resources for community outreach. She absorbed every detail, her sharp, analytical mind, once so focused on event planning and interior design, now focused on budgets, timelines, and logistics for a life-saving cause. She wasn't just writing a check, she was becoming a part of the solution. A week later, they booked a private jet, not for a lavish vacation, but for a 2-hour flight to Baltimore. It was an intentional choice. They could have managed everything remotely, but this was a pilgrimage. They needed to see it, feel it, and understand the place and the people they were now partnering with. As their driver navigated through the city's crowded, less-than-immaculate streets, the contrast with their perfectly manicured world was stark and undeniable. The hospital was an old, sprawling brick building, its facade weathered by decades of service. The waiting room was filled with the low hum of nervous parents and the quiet sounds of children. The Sterlings, for the first time in their lives, were not VIPs being ushered to a private room. They were just two people waiting for their appointment, looking around at the humanity that existed outside their own carefully constructed bubble. When Dr. Thorne met them, his smile was genuine, warm, and entirely without pretense. He was dressed in his doctor's scrubs, looking tired but radiating a quiet power that had nothing to do with wealth. "Richard, Eleanor, thank you so much for coming. I can't tell you how much this means to all of us." "The honor is ours, heiress," Richard replied, using his first name for the first time. "We need to see everything. The good, the bad, all of it. We need to know where our help is needed most." Dr. Thorne gave them a comprehensive tour. He showed them the state-of-the-art research lab, which was crammed into a small, underventilated space. He showed them the pediatric cardiac unit, where a team of brilliant, overworked nurses and doctors cared for fragile, tiny patients. He pointed out the worn-out monitors, the aging MRI machines, and the lack of space for new doctors. They met nurses who were working double shifts to cover for understaffing, and parents who had traveled for days to get their children the care they needed. In one room, Eleanor saw a young mother holding a newborn, a fragile, tiny being with a congenital heart defect. The baby's skin was tinged blue, just as Lily's had been on the plane. Eleanor's breath hitched in her throat. She looked at the mother, her face etched with a familiar fear and exhaustion, and she felt a profound connection, a deep, human understanding that transcended language and social status. In that moment, the debt of gratitude she felt for Dr. Thorne was magnified 1,000-fold. She wasn't just helping a doctor, she was helping this mother, this baby, and every other family in this hospital. The visit culminated in a press conference in the hospital's small, crowded auditorium. Dr. Thorne stood at the podium, a figure of humble authority, and introduced Richard Sterling. As Richard stepped up to the microphone, he looked out at the assembled journalists, doctors, and hospital staff. He had spoken at countless press conferences, but this was the first time his voice trembled with emotion. "Good morning," he began, his voice clear and resonant. "For years, my wife and I have been incredibly fortunate. We've built a life of comfort and success. And along the way we lost sight of what truly matters. We've come to realize that the greatest value of wealth isn't what it can buy for you, but what it can do for others." He looked at Eleanor, who was standing beside him, a pillar of strength and shared purpose. "We are here today to announce that the Sterling Foundation will be dedicating a substantial portion of its resources, $100 million to be exact, to establish the Thorne Fund for Pediatric Cardiac Care. This is a commitment not just of capital but of partnership. We will be working directly with Dr. Thorne and his incredible team to ensure they have every resource they need to continue their life-saving work." The room erupted in applause. The journalists were stunned by the sheer size of the donation, but the doctors and nurses were moved by the sincerity in his voice. Richard continued, his gaze finding Dr. Thorne in the crowd. "This is just the beginning. This is our promise to you. The work you do here is a testament to the best of humanity. You don't just save lives, you save futures. We are honored to join you in this mission." As he stepped down from the podium, Dr. Thorne walked up to him, his eyes filled with a gratitude so immense it was almost tangible. He shook Richard's hand, a silent acknowledgement of their shared history. In that moment, standing together in that crowded room, it was clear that the two men had found an unspoken connection, a bond forged not by a shared background but by a shared purpose. The Sterlings had paid their debt, but they had gained something far more valuable in return. A new sense of meaning, a life filled with purpose, and a new kind of family. They had come to this place of brokenness and need, not to find themselves, but to give of themselves, and in doing so they had found their way home. 2 years passed, a brief but transformative blink in the Sterling family's lives. The palatial estate in Greenwich, once a gilded cage of isolation, had become a base of operations for a new and profound mission. The Sterling Foundation, now officially renamed the Sterling Thorne Fund for Pediatric Cardiac Care, was a bustling hub of activity. The hushed halls of their mansion now echoed with the lively chatter of project managers, the decisive clicks of keyboards, and the low hum of conference calls dedicated to hospital expansion plans and community health initiatives. The foundation was a living, breathing testament to a family's changed heart. Richard Sterling, once the ruthless titan of finance, now found a deeper satisfaction in the intricate logistics of philanthropy. His days were no longer consumed by hostile takeovers but by the meticulous oversight of building new surgical wings and recruiting top medical talent for Dr. Thorne's hospital. He traveled, but his journeys were to medical conferences and health summits, not to boardrooms. His sharp mind, once focused on market gains, was now dedicated to maximizing the impact of every dollar, every resource, every act of goodwill. Eleanor's transformation was equally profound. The woman who once meticulously curated her life now found her greatest joy in its unplanned moments. She became an active and compassionate presence at the Baltimore hospital. She wasn't just a donor but a volunteer, often found in the waiting room, holding the hand of a terrified parent, or reading stories to children recovering from surgery. The sharp, glacial blue of her eyes had softened, filled with a warmth and empathy that had been dormant for so long. She and Dr. Thorne's team had become like a second family to her, bound by a shared purpose that went far beyond mere business. In Baltimore, the impact was undeniable. The outdated hospital was now a beacon of hope. The new cardiac wing, named the Lily Sterling Wing in honor of the catalyst for this change, was a state-of-the-art facility. New monitors glowed with vibrant colors, and advanced imaging machines allowed for more precise diagnoses than ever before. Dr. Eris Thorne, no longer a man fighting a constant, uphill battle for funding, was now the head of a world-class team of pediatric cardiologists. He was able to focus entirely on what he did best. healing children and advancing his groundbreaking research. The weariness that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a boundless energy and a quiet triumph that radiated from within. One crisp autumn afternoon, 2 years after the fateful flight, the Sterlings found themselves on a private plane once more. This time they were headed to a small town in rural Kentucky, where a new mobile health clinic, funded by their foundation, was being unveiled. Lily, now 9 years old, sat beside Eleanor, her small face pressed against the window, watching the patchwork of farms and forests below. She was a picture of health and vitality, a living testament to the power of a single act of kindness. As the plane hummed along, Eleanor noticed a young couple in the seats across from them. They were holding a small child, a tiny baby with a slight blue tinge to his lips. A knot of familiar fear tightened in her stomach, but this time, it was immediately replaced by a profound empathy. She looked at Richard, and he, without a word, knew exactly what she was thinking. He unbuckled his seatbelt and walked over to the couple, his face gentle and reassuring. "Excuse me," he said softly. "I couldn't help but notice. Is your little one okay?" The mother's eyes, tired and worried, welled with tears. "He has a heart condition. We're on our way to a specialist in Nashville. We're so worried." Richard knelt beside their seats. "I understand," he said, his voice filled with a genuine warmth. "My daughter had a similar condition. She was treated by the best. Would you mind if I gave you a call after we land? I'd like to see if we can get your son a consultation with our team. We have a fund specifically for this kind of thing. We want to help." The couple, stunned by his kindness, could only nod, their hearts filled with a hope they hadn't known existed. Later that evening, after the successful clinic dedication, the Sterlings sat down to dinner in a quiet restaurant with Dr. Thorne. The meal was simple, the conversation easy and filled with shared laughter and a sense of shared accomplishment. "You know," Dr. Thorne said, raising a glass, "I'm often asked how all this happened. How our small, underfunded hospital was able to build a new wing and save so many lives. And I always tell them the same thing. It started on a plane with a little girl, and with a family that had to learn the hardest lesson of their lives." Eleanor's eyes glistened with tears. "And a doctor who taught us that the greatest wealth isn't what you possess, but what you choose to give away." Richard looked at the two people who had not only saved his daughter's life but had also, in the process, helped him and his wife discover their own humanity. The journey had been difficult, a descent from arrogance to humility, from privilege to purpose. But it had been worth it. They had lost their sense of superiority, their comfort, and their illusions of control. But in doing so, they had gained something far more precious. A life of meaning, a new family, and a new understanding of what it means to be truly rich. The consequence of that day on the plane had not been a loss, but the greatest gift they could have ever received. The circle was now complete. Dear viewer, if you've watched up to this point, thank you for your support. I have a small request. If you enjoy my stories, you can subscribe to the channel, and don't hesitate to share your thoughts about the stories in the comments. Enjoy watching. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video.